Good morning to our colleagues in North America. Good afternoon in Europe. And I guess I could say good evening to anyone from Asia tuning in. This is the monthly webinar of the MERLIN project, a EU-sponsored research project into long-term conservation measures for aquatic and wetland ecosystems. And we are very lucky today to have with us Dr. Kerry Weyland, a senior researcher in the Social, Economic, and Geographical Sciences Department, specifically with the Environmental Governance and Land Management Group at the Hutton Institute in Aberdeen in Scotland. Briefly, because to go into all the things she's doing would take the whole webinar, I would say her research interests are how are efforts for adaptive co-governance shaped and constrained by existing institutions and ways of working, and how do various goals for environmental governance interact such that they might be joined, integrated, made more effective and efficient. One particular project Dr. Walyen is leading at the moment is a project called Galvanizing Change via Natural Capital. And that will explore if and how natural capital data and framings can be productive in galvanizing changes for sustainability. I must confess that I have a personal interest here because in my work with river management to adapt to climate change, it's often not been the natural science that seemed to block things, but very much the politics, culture, economic considerations which did not allow us to do the experimentation necessary to learn how to adapt. So I'm very interested to see this work and very grateful for Dr. Weyland to give us this seminar. The format, I believe, is roughly 20+ minutes of presentation and followed by a question and answer. And I would ask people to please use at the base here the raise hand function. When you have a question, I will try to call you in turn. And let's carry on now such that we can get on to good discussion. Dr. Weyland, please.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Right, let me just attempt to share my slides. Hopefully we have no more technical challenges. So can somebody give me some feedback? Am I showing you the right thing? Hopefully so.
Good.
Yes, it works.
Great. Okay, so thank you for the introduction and for the music, which I have to admit I was quite enjoying there and I didn't want it to end. So today I want to talk about monitoring and evaluation of nature-based solutions, or NBS as I sometimes call them, and suggest the need to think outside of the box at least some of the time. As Jan said, I work in the social sciences department. A long time ago when I didn't have grey hair, I originally trained as an ecologist. But since then, I've been trying to figure out this tricky people side of things and how, in particular, how kind of environmental interventions play out and what we can do to try and make them better, more inclusive, more holistic. And, you know, why might we need to think about monitoring? Why might the perspective of someone like me be relevant? Well, there we go. The monitoring literature is huge. You know, what more could we need? We've got 1.2 million search returns on Google Scholar. I didn't look at all of those 1.2 million returns, but I had a quick look in there, and it covers all sorts of topics, from GIS, so that's global information monitoring systems, to reporting, air, soil, and water pollutants, improving methods to detect novel pollutants like microplastics, and then exploring the cascading impacts of that on our ecosystems. So there's a lot in there. If we look slightly more narrowly at nature-based solutions, well, this is a more specific concept. It's also more recent. So we've only got 16,200 in there. And I did a very, a quick look there, and there's some keywords or kind of word cloud that comes out from the first pages of search returns. So we have similar themes. We also have a stronger focus on ecosystem services, ecosystem health, and sometimes the health of people. So slightly different, but similar. And, this is a wealth of knowledge. This is what I think of as the box. Why on earth would we need to think outside of this box? Well, stepping outside the box, I argue that when we do nature-based solutions, we're seeking to intervene in very complex systems. And this diagram here is quite a famous one from Ella Ostrom. And she's saying that, natural resources, biophysical interactions, they're just part of the system, but equally so are governance systems, so are users, so those are the people who are working with, affecting, influencing our natural resources. We need to look at all of those things, and we need to look at how they interact. And so we need to understand all the different parts of that system, the social, the economic, the political, as much as the biophysical, the ecological. And that also implies that we tend to have quite imperfect understanding and control, because it's such a huge, complicated thing. We can't perfectly expect to be able to predict our actions when we intervene. So therefore, if we're looking to intervene or do something like nature-based solutions, we need to be adaptive. We need to try and expect we're going to have to change and learn. And this is the basic idea behind adaptive management. So this is a phrase commonly heard in environmental circles. The idea at its heart, so back in 1978, a kind of famous seminal book, I think it was, designing and revising plans to allow knowledge collection that informs decision-making. So that sounds really sensible. Plan to do something that you can learn from. And these days, what we often have as well, an additional emphasis on involving and working with stakeholders. So what is sometimes called co-management, or sometimes just buried within the label adaptive management. And this is now a central concept in environmental management. You see it mentioned in so many papers. It's also, I should note, principle number 7 in the Iucn Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. And I'll come back to nature-based solutions later, but I just want to focus for the moment on adaptive management and monitoring. And so it's essential, and many would say unavoidable, where we are dealing with complexity. It's kind of inevitable, kind of logical consequence that we have to try and plan for adaptive management. However, it remains rare. So this paper back in 2013, I think they went looking and they found a lot of people mention it, but very few people actually report doing it. Obviously challenges remain, and we need a bit of effort to get it right. So just to dig a bit more into the adaptive management cycle. So at the top here, we have planning, management actions and monitoring, making those plans explicit, implementing the plan, including monitoring, and then evaluating the effects of whatever was done, capturing that learning, sharing it, and then reconceptualizing the situation and coming up with a new plan if need be. So, sounds simple enough, like many things when seen from a distance. And then I've got the hands in there just to show co-management would imply that at every step of that process, you can and perhaps should be involving one or more stakeholder groups. So nothing to complain about there. Seems straightforward, seems logical. So if we think about monitoring and we work backwards from this, we have to think, well, is our monitoring supporting adaptive management? What are we monitoring? How is monitoring carried out? And are our decisions actually being informed by or using this monitoring information? So these are simple questions, but they're not necessarily simple to answer because, of course, complex systems have lots of components and parts to them. Now, I make no apology that the next slide has quite a lot of words on it, but it's really just to make the point that it's not simple to answer the questions. So a couple of years ago, my colleague Kirsty and I went through all the literature in adaptive management and drew in lots of other literatures, formative evaluation, all sorts of literatures, and kind of came up with some principles for what ideal monitoring might look like for adaptive management. So on the left there, you've got what is monitored, how is monitoring carried out, and does it inform decision-making, the same as we saw on the previous slide. And here we have some more detail about the criteria, things you need to think about when you're answering that. Are we looking at all ecosystem processes, biotic and abiotic elements? Are we looking at social aspects, economic aspects? To understand change, are we looking at context and drivers on the system? And on and on. And so there's the point there about you need to use primary data where you have it, but also consider secondary data. So what do we already have out there? Are you working with lots of different individuals and organizations? Who is out there that could help? And are the monitoring data accessible? And are they actually being used? Is it documented? Who's making decisions on the basis of this? So those are kind of ideals. And if you are interested to know more, there's links at the end of this talk where that particular paper has got a link to it. But if we turn back to reality, I said that adaptive management often doesn't happen, but I didn't say necessarily, what does monitoring look like? How does monitoring practice compare to that? Well, they have received criticism. This is the general environmental management literature, not specifically or solely nature-based solutions. So within this general literature, there's been a criticism that there's an undue focus on biological or biophysical indicators, and without understanding how an intervention contributed to these. So maybe looking at parameters of water quality without understanding the processes that led to those ultimate outcomes. There's insufficient attention to socioeconomic aspects, and we often find overlooking non-scientific sources and related to that, non-quantitative types of knowledge. So often when we're in conversations about monitoring, we hear people talking about data, and I suspect there's a kind of assumption that there's an Excel spreadsheet with lots of numbers in it somewhere. And if the knowledge about system doesn't fit in that format, it tends not to be seen as monitoring or useful for monitoring. So I would argue this is one reason, not necessarily the only reason, but one reason why adaptive management remains rare. And it's worth thinking again about monitoring. Now, I need to note, there's very strong reasons why we have a focus of certain things and not on others. And one of these reasons is policy. So a couple of years ago, I had a look with many colleagues across Europe as part of an alternate study at monitoring practices that were driven by policy in Europe. So I'd be fascinated, for those of you who've come from outside of Europe to this talk today, I'd love to know about experiences elsewhere. But we looked along the top there, we have 3 headline policies that are very influential in Europe. So we have the Natura 2000 policies, the Habitats and Birds Directive, we have the Water Framework Directive, and we have agri-environment schemes under the Common Agricultural Policy. And we looked at the monitoring that was required and mandated under each of these in 9 EU cases. So that's mostly at the country level, but sometimes devolved to a region where policymaking's devolved. And we looked at what is monitored on the left, and we looked at how monitoring is carried out. And all you need to do is look at the color of the smiley faces here to get a sense that policy was not driving monitoring that was necessarily going to aid adaptive management. So the Water Framework Directive, for example, was quite useful, that it drove a focus on understanding ecosystem processes more than the other policies. But that wasn't necessarily perfect, because when it came to using that data, it didn't require or prompt anybody to connect that with broader drivers of change. So, for example, if a wastewater treatment plant had to suddenly discharge a lot of sewage into a lake, there wasn't actually a formal requirement that that be featured in the reports made with the monitoring data and used in evaluation. One hopes it would be, of course, but it was very much sort of left as a sort of discretionary thing. And of course, without this kind of big picture, it can be really hard to fairly judge what's going on and understand why things have happened. And then the second row there, how is monitoring carried out? Well, we see that generally it's mostly to focus on primary data collection. Sometimes we see the use of secondary data, so that's reports from generated by other actors elsewhere, perhaps due to other policies. And that was quite good under the Natura 2000 policies, but really not great for the other 2. And this matters because policy in Europe, and so I'm sure in many other places, is a really strong influence on what we end up doing. There's often so few resources for environmental management that whatever we do have to do becomes the focus of all our efforts. So in summary, when we look at ideals versus reality, and some of the challenges and imperfections can be driven by things like policy. For example, at least in my work, I see a focus on describing states and trends in the environment rather than necessarily understanding the effect of specific interventions, which is what we need for adaptive management. Generally, I'd say the monitoring literature is focused on understanding a few issues, for example, maybe many measurements of water quality, rather than building up a whole systems perspective. Rarely is there that much attention to social issues, even though these can be key influences on say, a protected area or a catchment. And there's often little attention, at least formally, to contextual factors that might be affecting what the systems we're trying to intervene in. Climate change, I don't know, changing market prices on land, all these things could be interacting to change our systems at the same time as we're trying to introduce our new nature-based solutions project or whatever it is. And then also there's the issues about limited public access to monitoring data and very little transparency about if and how monitoring data are used. So this is not really an idea in line with the idea of supporting inclusivity. So reality doesn't often match up to ideals, but I want to make really clear this is not necessarily the fault of anyone. It's certainly not the fault of project or site managers. Monitoring is expensive. I mean, the literature talk about an ideal of 10% of resources being spent on monitoring, but often many projects are constrained or unable to achieve that. And there are so many knowledge gaps, it can be really hard to know what to target, which ones can we improve on, which ones should we be filling. There's lots of strong drivers to carry on doing what's already been happening or not to be doing anything differently because we have to report upwards on a certain issue. And also there's generally little chance to reflect or change. I mean, those who work in environmental management know that it's often a kind of high pressure situation. We're trying to do as much as possible with very little resources. So it's not exactly that much space to think or reflect, should we be doing something differently? So now I want to think about the implications for nature-based solutions specifically. And firstly, I want to talk about the Iucn global standard just briefly. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it. I suspect some of you are very familiar and others perhaps less so. So just with one slide on this. So this is what it looks like. This is the 8 principles. If you're not already familiar with it, I've got the link to it at the back of these slides. And these 8 principles obviously contain a wealth of detail, but they're seen as strongly interlinked. And you've probably noticed that number 7 here, adaptive management. So that's obviously key to nature-based solutions, even separate to any other considerations I just pointed out. And if I look through the principles in detail, so on the left here, I've pointed out some things. So number 7 is adaptive management. Within that, it's got sort of 3 separate subheadings. You should be articulating a theory of change, i.e. what are your assumptions? If you do X, what will happen as a result of it? You should be making and implementing explicit plans for monitoring and evaluation, and you should be using this for learning. So this is very similar to the points I've just been making. Additionally, if you look through the other principles, there are snippets in there that are also relevant. So within principle number 2, designing at scale, you see attention to context and the need to understand interactions across levels. Within the principle number 3, which is focused on biodiversity net gain, there's more there on how to go about monitoring and evaluation, and in particular, the need to assess unintended consequences. And then within principle number 5, inclusive governance, well, that comes back to this idea of co-management and trying to do as much as possible with stakeholders and thinking about where they can be involved. So in short, the Iucn global standard also makes clear that monitoring matters and also makes some suggestions for monitoring, which I would argue are kind of in line with the points I was just making, where I've started more, from the general literature on environmental management. So thinking about what this might mean for a particular kind of nature-based solution initiative, of course, is the challenge. And I have taken here a picture from our general MERLIN set of pictures. This is a kind of stereotypical catchment, because MERLIN deals with nature-based solutions that are in catchments. And here you can see you've got everything from upstream to downstream, and you've got a variety of land uses and human settlements within it. So the first question, if we look at this system, what do we need to monitor is achieved over time? What would we have to look at? We need progress to ultimate goals. So in Europe, nature-based solutions are ideally going to be contributing to the Green Deal. So we could be thinking about the Green Deal indicators, which are quite high level, things like contributions to green jobs growth, human health and well-being. We could look at slightly more proximate goals. So for example, hectares of floodplain that have been reconnected. And, in between this, there would be a wealth or potentially a wealth of other sort of intermediate steps. I don't know, the habitat specific location of your floodplains that have been connected. or slightly higher level, the actual contribution to predicted flood risks in the next 100 years. So you could see already there's a lot to think about there. We also need to understand, though, why and how outcomes are achieved, not just what happens, but why. So then we need to understand context. So, for example, when I say AES, I mean agri-environmental subsidies. You know, have those changed? Suddenly, how are farmers and land managers acting differently because of new subsidies, or maybe there's new market prices, as we're often seeing at the moment, really changing land management practices. And this, of course, matters if for catchment management, because whatever happens on the land has consequences for the hydrological system and the quality of our waters. We potentially, when we're thinking about this, we could think about different points of view, community views, for example, on a new riparian woodland, what are the different values it will have? And we should also be monitoring process and thinking about process. So I don't know, the number and type of planning meetings had, the efforts made to access funding, what worked, what didn't work well. And then the last point to make is about using more sources of knowledge and points of view. So, for example, there might be existing knowledge that could be used made by municipalities or local authorities, perhaps predictions of future population growth, for example, project plan documentation that's been kind of created for other purposes, data sets collected under other policies that perhaps aren't necessarily thought of as environmental. You could be using land managers and communities' local knowledge of sites. And this is relevant to thinking about designing nature-based solutions, but also to evaluating them, or, you know, judgments of success and what's been achieved, say, by local residents, can be just as valid as those collected by other means, depending especially on the subject at hand. So, for example, the recreational value of, I don't know, a new riparian woodland again. So, what could be monitored? How can we understand what affected the outcomes? And then, you know, what kind of sources of knowledge can we use? And then there's one more thing to say, which is, you know, who's using the knowledge? So this comes back to decision-making, evaluation and decision-making. We can think across levels. So we can think in terms of site managers, project managers, program managers. You could maybe think of a policymaker who's seeking to enable nature-based solutions. You also could be thinking across sectors. So what evidence perhaps do investors need if they are to justify a new intervention and then to understand its consequences and make decisions for their future about where else they're going to invest in nature-based solutions? Or a water utility. Obviously, there's a huge range there, but this is really important when we think about enabling nature-based solutions and mainstreaming them, i.e. working across sectors, and upscaling them, i.e. doing nature-based solutions at a bigger scale more often. We can't just continue to work with a very small set of the kind of usual suspects, which tend to be people from public agencies, supported by scientists. That's the sort of stereotypical, perhaps core stakeholders thought of as kind of working in the environmental realm, perhaps with a few environmental NGOs involved as well. But ultimately, if we want to achieve nature-based solutions at a greater scale, we need to make this a cross-societal mission, not just in an idea of a few. So monitoring can also play its part in that. And perhaps I'm getting away from adaptive management here, but obviously if you're sitting down to make a monitoring plan, these considerations should be in mind. So thinking about conclusions here, I'm going to argue that if we think about the adaptive management cycle, and we think about the principles for nature-based solutions that come from the Iucn, and then we think about the particular system that we want to intervene in. If we put all those things together, that should be the basis of a fair, open reflection on what we need for monitoring. Ensure that we're not stuck in a particular issue when perhaps we need to be thinking about other things as well. So I argue that we need to think about all parts of the system. We need to think about social, economic and ecological parts of the system. We need to attend to context and process and intermediate steps, as well as the ultimate intended outcomes. We need to involve more stakeholders more often and be looking for other sources of knowledge. And we need to be working backwards from what decision makers mean. When I say decision makers, sometimes that gets conflated with policy, but I don't necessarily mean policymakers. Lots of us are making decisions about if and how we can get involved and support nature-based solutions. But I mean, I think at this point, you're probably thinking, oh my goodness, I cannot monitor everything. And I totally agree. Oh, it's frozen. So we cannot monitor everything all the time, everywhere with everyone. And this is the big challenge of systems thinking, isn't it? We can't hold it all on our heads, and we certainly can't do everything and be everywhere all at once. It is a real challenge. And it's one that I don't have perfect answers for. So there's often little time and money for implementation, let alone monitoring, or even thinking on monitoring. And by this point, you know, you might be thinking to think outside of the box, we also need a giant treasure box in order to be able to fund all of this. But I think it is worth reflection. I would argue that it's useful to build a kind of a broad picture of the whole system and think about our consequences of our interventions within it, rather than having a narrow, really in-depth picture of a corner of the system, but maybe missing some other bigger issues. So in conclusion, I think thinking outside the box, it can help us improve our monitoring and learning about nature-based solutions. Some, but not all of these ideals for perfect monitoring are definitely going to be tricky or expensive to implement. But I think it's worthwhile just reflecting on it at least. Because if we can focus on nature-based solutions as interventions in complex, messy systems, then I think it will be worthwhile. It'll help us build better understanding of nature-based solutions in general, and it can help us improve our practices in specific cases. So that's got to be worth trying for, right? So those are some broad thoughts about monitoring, and I hope they are of interest, and I'll be really fascinated to hear experiences in other places and cases. And thank you very much. There's some sources of more reading there, but I'm also very happy to talk with anyone now or afterwards about some of these kind of broad ideas and about how they might be applied to more specific situations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weyland, for a very clear presentation, and mercifully within time limits, so that we have time for some questions. Already one question that was posted in the chat, and I urge anyone to post some questions in the chat. At the same time, well, at the moment, I cannot see the entire, all other people. So for the moment, I will have to ask you to put it in the chat so that I can refer it. But the first question, without any further ado, from Alejandro Dusayan, his question is, what would you suggest, given your experience, do we need to include at the pre-proposal stage so as to consider minimum standards to facilitate adaptive management, considering limited resources, of course?
So Alejandro, thanks for your question. I guess, are you thinking about a proposal as a research proposal or a proposal as a site manager? That would be helpful to know if you have the ability to speak, which you may not, but I'll have a look in the chat. Research proposal, yeah. So I think it would be really useful to point this out in a proposal and then just say, well, this is what we are proposing to do. This is how we fit in with it. We're aware that we're ideally part of a bigger whole. But we have a big issue here that whether you're a researcher or a site manager, you can't change the whole system by yourself. So ideally, we would need our funders as well to be aware of the need for a kind of broad perspective and not necessarily funding any one individual initiative to be building that up, but thinking about the balance in their portfolio about what they're enabling. And also just allowing and permitting more resources for monitoring to be seen as a valid and worthwhile thing. Because at the moment, it often feels like a bit of a luxury. But certainly as researchers, I hope that we have the ability to point out where we fit, what bit of the puzzle that we're contributing to, even if we can't contribute to all parts of it.
Thank you very much. I see another question from Iucn. That is, what would you suggest, given your experience Oh, sorry, somehow they didn't. If we're interested in holistic monitoring and adaptive management context, do you have some key indicators in mind that work in various contexts and can save money while providing maximum information?
Well, that's a tricky one. Of course, it depends a bit on your specific setting. But one of the things I've noticed is that sort of local authorities often make plans in the local authorities, municipalities, I know language will vary depending on the country you're in, local government. They will often make plans and be collecting information, or at least making forecasts and predictions about the future population in their area, population levels, but also consequences perhaps for demands for services, which could include things that are relevant to nature, so loading on water systems, demand for drinking water connections and wastewater. Also predictions about the kind of jobs that people will be doing, which has some implications for the kind of resources that might be needed or not. So I guess that to kind of look for something positive that might already be out there that might help to build a broader systems perspective, that might be one place to look that most of us, could be relevant to most of our settings. I hope that helped. I couldn't see this question written, so if not, let me know.
Now I'm going to get in trouble by mispronouncing a name, but this is from Chinomtso Onwubiko. Do you think nature-based solutions are enough? I ask because I am working on a project involving using nature-based solutions to reduce flooding.
Well, so nature-based solutions should be a good thing, especially if they're implemented in line with the Iucn concept, which is about protecting and enhancing biodiversity and striving to deliver multiple goals. But if nature-based solutions are interpreted as a really single issue kind of way and ends up with sort of single issue sort of narrow projects, that potentially is not enough and is going to be quite unhelpful, because we have a lot of pressures on our natural environment. We're seeking them to do lots of things for us as a society, and that's even leaving aside the issue of protecting their biodiversity and naturally functioning ecosystems in their own right. So we really need to have a joined up perspective when we're trying to deliver nature-based solutions projects, otherwise they definitely won't be enough. And then beyond that, I think the project focus is not enough. So we need to see governance systems changing. We need to systemic change, potentially transformation, rather than expecting that we're going to be able to save the world through individual short-term projects here and there. But of course, that's probably a subject for another day.
So I do not see a question written, and here just in time. From Pire Nukas, what would you consider key in monitoring that NBS are inclusive enough?
Oh, good question. I don't think I'm going to sit here as the arbiter of what is good enough. I think some of it just comes down to sitting and working through and thinking, what could we do? And then, realistically, okay, well, we're only going to do these things because, frankly, we don't have £1 billion or €1 billion or $1 billion to do our project. But at least showing you thought about what you could do would be the good first step. What I perhaps would say is enough if I am the ultimate judge. Beyond that, I think I would really seek to get some kind of representation in the actual decision-making part of that adaptive management cycle. At the moment, we do see citizens of various sorts being involved in some citizen science, and that often tends to be the first thing that's thought of when we've got to bring in stakeholders. Okay, well, let's get them to help with the data collection, which is great and fine and can be useful, but it would be good to see them thinking at every part of the cycle. Is there one thing we could do at least at every part of the cycle to at least consult, engage with, think about how we can work with others?
Great. At the moment, don't see a question, and I'll take my prerogative as moderator. I have a couple myself. One is, would you consider the use of role-playing games with stakeholders as a way to track the existence and dynamics of framings and mental models that influence the acceptance of institutions?
Oh, goodness, that's a very specific question.
Something I'm involved in.
Is the right answer yes? Yeah, I think role playing can be, actually, it's really funny because earlier this morning I had a meeting about if and how we could work with new sources of finance and investors in nature-based solutions. Same project, slightly different conversation. And there was a bit of a kind of like, oh, but these certain people don't even see the need for this conversation. How can we get them to start thinking about this? And I wrote and I said, well, we could try role playing. So I think it's a wonderful way to get people thinking outside of the box for lots of different reasons and different contexts, but certainly this included.
I would simply add, when we have done it, that's actually, we call them serious games. We have people trained in psychology monitoring it, and in the debriefing, then we discuss what ideas were brought up by whom, when, and try to link it to what seem to be the mental models and paradigms that are in play. And it gives you an idea who would accept an institution, who would block it. You know, so the institutions may be on paper, but they may not be operational just because of the attitudes the stakeholders have. Searching madly, and I hear no hands are raised, so I will add my provocative question number 2. Oh, wait a second. Alejandro has asked another question, so I'll have to wait.
Okay, so what if a nature-based solutions project has potential negative effects that haven't been assessed well due to a lack of baseline data? So the nature-based solutions project is going to look good on paper, you're saying. Yeah, we have a potential problem there because quite often with any kind of project that we're bound up with, and I speak for myself here, we don't want to think about bad consequences. It feels like a personal failure. So perhaps this comes back to the inclusivity aspect, that if we had a few more points of view involved in the planning and the sort of design and monitoring, that maybe would kind of guard against most of our natural tendencies to only focus on the positive. So I think that would be my advice there. Obviously, when you're in the situation where you think there's potential negative effects, but they haven't been documented, that is quite tricky to prove. I mean, I guess it depends who you're trying to prove it to. But if that is a point of view that can be brought into a conversation, then that's a good starting point. So just because that wasn't originally a baseline for it, well, that's a shame. But you could at least put something in place now and then continue to monitor it in future. Because with monitoring and evaluation, it shouldn't be seen as something that you make a plan at the start and then you review it maybe after 5 years and then that's it. Ideally, all these things are living documents. So you update your plan, but you probably need to update your monitoring as well.
Okay, we have another question from Florian Leistner. Nature-based solutions are in response to human problems. It's seeking solutions, although it would be nice to monitor all elements that influence, impact, and drive the solution. Wouldn't be the main and primary purpose of monitoring identifying if the goal is reached, i.e. solution to that problem was found? Wouldn't that trump all other monitoring efforts? So do you consider a hierarchy in monitoring are all equally important?
Oh, hierarchy is a tricky one. I don't know. I think, well, definitely you need to have some kind of measurement of your intermediate and ultimate outcomes. But for the sake of argument, you could have what appears to be a success, but actually it happened because of completely different reasons. I'm trying to think of an example here. Maybe pollution has gone down in a water system, but actually that's just because heavy industry has moved out. It's been nothing to do with the intervention of a project. And therefore, from the point of view of the funder, that's actually a waste of money because it would have happened anyway. Or from the point of view of the project manager, maybe they could have been doing something else or intervening in a different part of the system because the pollution problem was going to go away anyway. I mean, that's a completely made up example, but I'd argue that you always need to be looking at what's happening elsewhere in the system to get a fair sense of whether the project is on track and worthwhile. And it can go the other way, that a project is actually helping to reduce the impact, the scale of a problem, but perhaps it hasn't completely succeeded. But that's not necessarily the fault of the project, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be supporting that initiative. So
there's a question from Esther Carmen. Can development of monitoring indicators help or hinder change? I worry that things may get missed in complex systems. Mindsets get reinforced in this process.
So I think indicators, yeah, it can be good and bad. I think they can be good. I mean, if they're sort of mandated indicators, they can drive what gets done for better or worse. But of course, the downside is they lock in flexibility. And what we really need when we're working with systems is flexibility. And so many aspects of our culture and our lives, kind of managerialism, we want efficiency, we don't want you going around doing random things. There's so many reasons why flexibility is hard to achieve that I hesitate to recommend something that might further hinder that. But I would say kind of indicators that are broad and then that people can identify how their particular initiative relates to them, those could be a positive force for change, for kind of prompting everyone to think a bit about how they're relating to the broader system and how their monitoring is helping them to understand their work.
I would like to follow on with that. Then if adaptive management is iterative learning, could we not change the indicators every time it iterates as we reconsider factors?
Yeah, and I think there's a real tension here between the different reasons we do monitoring, because if you're looking to build up information, long-term information about state and trends in the environment, what you need is consistency, isn't it? And so that can be in tension with monitoring for learning about a particular intervention that you've carried out. So I totally admit that there's a bit of a tension there. And I guess you just need to, again, it's all about balance. Can you do both? Can you have one indicator that's being carried on year after year and another one that, you know what, we're going to cut this year, but we're going to do something else instead, because that's what's going to help us learn about our site. I think you need both.
Right. So there's a question from Henning. Are there statistics on nature-based solutions restoration projects that failed, but through efficient monitoring of previous projects could have been made successful? This would be a good basis for decision makers who fund monitoring to convince them of the benefits of investing in monitoring and evaluation.
I'm not aware of any information like that.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who does, please write in.
Okay. No questions on the horizon, so I'll ask my second provocative question, which is, scientists are criticized for being project-based and project-oriented, even though that's one of the few ways they get funded. Would it not be very productive to institutionalize adaptive management, such as a river commission, such that it's not project-based, it operates in perpetuity? That's one of the arguments for things like commissions, which have lives that are much longer than political cycles.
Generally, I'd agree with you, so I wouldn't find that a provocative question. I guess, you know, the reason why we have projects is this drive for efficiency, and well, one of the reasons anyway, and it tends to be at odds with that. And also just to disagree with myself, I do remember reading once this observation. It was looking at all the international conventions that there are, so slightly different subject. And it was observing that how many of them have been created in the last 100 years, or at least, you know, since 1945, but how nearly all but one persist. So we're very reluctant to shut things down or change big things. And they tend to kind of perpetuate themselves. Yeah. And that would be the downside of your proposal, Jan, is that we might end up with commissions which have flexibility within them to kind of adapt different things, but perhaps themselves start to reflect a certain mindset and are rather resistant to, they have their own groupthink and their own way of doing things, which is perhaps really difficult to change, perhaps harder to change because they're higher level. So I don't know, I tend to support your idea though, so I totally will support any proposition you make for that.
The buzzword for that is path dependence.
Yes.
But I believe that that's why adaptive management was put forward as an iterative learning, such that with each iteration, one can regroup as you learn new things. But it's very hard for reasons you mentioned.
I think also the general, I mean, I mentioned it a bit, but earlier in these answers, but failure feels like personal failure, doesn't it? Anything that didn't go well, you know, we all do it in job appraisals, whatever it is in life, my gardening, you know, admitting to failure just feels uncomfortable and unpleasant, even seeing it. And so we have a natural tendency as individuals to kind of shirk away from it. And this is arguably magnified by institutions and by dominant political cultures where, you know, certainly in the UK and I think many other Western political cultures, admission of imperfections is seized on as evidence of total failure. And so for a politician or a policymaker to say, well, this could be improved is a difficult thing. And so I am the first to sit here and say, yeah, adaptive management is not something easily achieved, but we need to recognize why it is. And, monitoring is a good place to start, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know about Europe, but in the United States, there is a movement that if something has been publicly funded, one must publish it. There's a lot of evidence of the pharmaceutical industry hiding data they didn't want revealed. But so they're saying if the public funded that research, they cannot hide it. They must publish everything.
Yeah, so there's a big drive to open science, which is embedded in MERLIN and all the other European projects, and is certainly in the UK a really important thing. But there's also certainly in Europe, the Aarhus Convention. So that's reinforcing the commitment to transparency and public participation in environmental processes. And we have, of course, the ability to do freedom of information requests, especially on environmental issues. We have enhanced rights. So as European citizens, we have some ability to be requesting and accessing, and some right to be expecting transparency. Maybe I'm too nice, but I often think it's not deliberate kind of collusion or hiding of failure. It's just a kind of mindset that leads us all to focus on certain things, and a general tendency to want to focus on the positive rather than stepping back and going, oh my goodness, maybe we missed this big other thing that we should have been looking at, this other big problem.
Some irreverent scientists criticize how we teach statistics, saying we're terrified of type 1 error and we don't really give a damn about type 2 error. And
yeah.
So anyway, we have a question from Jörg Strackbein. If even psychological expertise is required to guide stakeholder boards into progress and transformation, analyzing mindsets, as Jan was explaining, how much further do we have to go to succeed in these challenges?
Well, I think we're further forward than we were in the past, trying to be positive. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, you wouldn't have had so many social scientists in consortia that we do have now on the projects that work on topics like nature-based solutions. Well, the social scientists would be seen as an adjunct, there to do a bit of a service role or just to kind of share the information. So things are changing. I don't know how much more we have to do. I think more the challenge is the urgency of transformation. We're dealing with really rapid changes in our environments, high pressures. We've got lots of things that we want from nature. And it's a really slow process, winning hearts and minds, building a relationship with the stakeholder group, to build, to understand their views. So in my mind, that's actually the bigger challenge, is, figuring out what we can do that's enough, allows us to act quickly enough. Because these things generally take time, but the big challenges we're facing are not waiting for us. As is very apparent, the nature crisis, the climate crisis. We, on the one hand, know that many of us feel that we need to act very quickly and we need to do something soon. But to avoid accusations of this being a kind of technocratic top-down idea, and indeed to avoid it just not succeeding at all, we somehow need to work with society, those of us who think change is needed. So this is a really tough thing, but I think we do have all the skills, Jörg, and I think it's also something that sometimes if it's about building relationships, some people have the aptitude, especially with a bit of encouragement. There's a lot of professional facilitators out there whose job it is to kind of work with groups, steer processes, do planning. So the resources are out there. The challenge is the time.
I just learned that actually it was my mistake. It was Sebastian, not Jörg, who asked it. But
sorry, I can't see.
Oh no, my fault, not yours. At this moment, I'm out of provocative questions, and no one else is lobbing any into the chat, or I have not heard. I can't see, but no one is raising their hand. So I guess at this point we would just simply, we're coming, I believe, toward the end of the hour. We could just be grateful for the clarity of presentation and clarity of answers, that we may have answered everything in this hour, but I doubt it. I have kept a record of all the questions as well as the links, and I will try to make that available, or if anybody would like to follow up on this. So if there are no further questions, thank you very much. Dr. Weyland for a wonderful presentation and excellent, sharp responses. And I believe there should be an announcement of the next seminar in, I believe that's June. I don't have that information in front of me, so I'd have to ask either Astrid or Jörg to step forward to just promote that so that everyone can participate at the next one. Oh, and I see here that there will be, the recording will be available at the website. So if you want to see this again and go over the presentation at where you can see it in the chat here, projectmerlin.edu/academy.html. Great. Well then, thanks everyone. And we look forward to seeing you in a month. Here in Vienna, the horse chestnuts are in bloom and it's a great time to sit under them and drink a beer. I hope wherever you are, you're enjoying your spring.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.